So, I want you to try and picture a summer afternoon in Berlin.
Okay, setting the scene.
Yeah, it's July 26, 2026, and the city is hosting Christopher Street Day, which, if you don't know, is this massive, really vibrant annual celebration honoring the queer community.
Right, it's a huge event.
Huge. I mean, the weather is warm, there's music echoing off those beautiful historic buildings, and you've got this massive crowd gathered right near the Brandenburg Gate.
Just a total festival of joy, right?
Exactly. It is a celebration of human diversity, just people living openly in this modern metropolis. And then, then the unthinkable happens.
Yeah.
A rented van accelerates and just drives directly into that crowd.
It is, it's just a devastating, horrific image. And the aftermath is exactly what you would expect from that kind of trauma.
Utter chaos.
Right. One person's left dead on the street, 29 others are wounded, and the whole city is plunged into panic.
And the driver, he was eventually shot and killed after a day-long manhunt, right?
Yes. He was a 21-year-old man. And the really crucial detail here is that he was born right there in Germany.
Oh, wow. So not a foreigner.
No, not a foreign combatant slipping across some border. He was known to local authorities as being embedded in the city's Islamist milieu.
Right.
So almost immediately, before the dust had even settled, the authorities and the press concluded that this attack was driven by Islamist extremist ideology.
And we all know the script that plays out in the media the moment a tragedy like this occurs. I mean, we've seen it, 100 times?
At least.
On one side, you have these opportunists who use the attacker to condemn an entire global religion. They just flatten 14 million people into the actions of, a single man in a rented van.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
Exactly. But then on the other side, you get this equally reflexive, almost desperate press release response from advocacy groups saying this has absolutely nothing to do with Islam.
Right, the automatic defense.
Yeah. Both sides just retreat to their corners. But the sources we're doing a deep dive into today, which include this really profound primary essay supported by a towering stack of historical texts, they refuse both of those easy answers.
They do. They really refuse to let us off the hook that easily.
Because both of those reflexive answers are, they're historically illiterate, right?
That's exactly it. The texts we are looking at today ask a much more difficult, much more demanding question of us.
Which is, how do you reconcile this modern, brutal, puritanical violence with 14 centuries of a civilization that produced some of the world's most sublime love poetry?
And the most complex metaphysical philosophy.
Right, and this incredibly deep tradition of mystical devotion. Because, when you place the young man in the van next to a figure like Rumi or the great Islamic philosophers of the medieval period, they don't even look like they belong to the same universe.
Let alone the same religious tradition.
Exactly. So the mission of our deep dive today is to explore this massive, completely paradigm-shifting argument.
And it really is a paradigm shift.
It is. Our sources make the case that this young man in the van wasn't actually defending historical Islam at all. In fact, he was entirely disconnected from it.
Which is wild to think about, given his stated motives.
Right. The texts argue that he was defending a distinctly modern, imported pathology. And here's the kicker. One that was actually engineered in the very West he thought he was attacking.
Yeah, that is the core irony we have to unpack.
So to really understand the mechanics of how that happened, how a whole civilization shifts from beautiful poetry to rented vans, we are going to have to unpack some really profound cultural shifts. We have to look at the mechanisms of colonial history.
And we have to completely reevaluate our definitions of human identity.
Yes. So I want to jump straight into the mindset of this attacker because the primary essay we're working from starts with a sort of diagnosis.
Right, a historical diagnosis.
Yeah. And to make this diagnosis, the author leans on a historian named Thomas Bauer. Specifically, his work, it's called A Culture of Ambiguity.
A really essential text for this topic.
It really is. Now, I've read a lot of history, but Bauer makes a claim about classical Islamic civilization that fundamentally disrupted how I view the past.
How so?
Well, we are so used to seeing historical religion depicted as this rigid, black and white, highly punitive monolith. But Bauer argues that for the vast majority of its history, Islamic civilization was defined by its extraordinary tolerance for ambiguity.
We really need to spend some time on this word, ambiguity.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
Because in modern English, it has a slightly negative connotation.
Right, like you're being evasive.
Exactly. If I say you're being ambiguous, it implies you're being vague or You just haven't done the work to find the right answer. But Bauer is talking about something entirely different.
What's his definition?
He is talking about a structural, civilizational comfort with plurality. It's the capacity of a whole society to hold multiple, sometimes totally contradictory truths in suspension without feeling the psychological panic to resolve them into one single dominant rule.
Okay, let's ground this for you listening because plurality can sound, very abstract. What did this comfort with ambiguity actually look like in the day-to-day operation of classical Islamic society?
Well, it manifested at the very highest levels of theology and law.
Give me an example.
Imagine a society where you have multiple legally valid readings of the exact same Quranic verse.
Wait, like different interpretations?
Not just different interpretations, but actually different vocalizations of the text that changed the nuance of the meaning, and they all coexisted.
Wow.
Yeah. You had competing schools of jurisprudence, the Maliki, the Hanafi, the Shafi'i, the Hanbali, which were entirely different legal traditions with completely different methodologies.
And they didn't just tear each other apart.
No, they didn't go to war to annihilate each other at all. They explicitly recognized each other's legitimacy.
That is wild.
Right. An action might be considered totally forbidden in one school and entirely permissible in another. And the society just absorbed that friction without collapsing.
I was really trying to visualize how a society functions like that because our modern instinct is that laws have to be uniform. If it's illegal here, it has to be illegal there.
We demand consistency.
We do. And the image that kept coming to my mind while reading Bauer's work was a massive suspension bridge.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
Yeah, think about it. If you look at how a suspension bridge is engineered, its genius is that it is explicitly designed to sway and flex under the weight of different winds, right?
Right, and the friction of different traffic.
Exactly. The shifts in atmospheric pressure, that flexibility, that structural ambiguity is exactly why the bridge doesn't break. It absorbs the tension of the environment.
It needs that give.
Right. But then, as we move into the 19th and 20th centuries, under the immense pressure of colonial modernity, it's as if the engineers of the Islamic world just panicked.
They looked at their swaying bridge and got terrified.
Yeah. They looked at the rigid steel and stone structures of the European powers that were suddenly dominating them, and they mistook their own flexibility for weakness. And so they decided to encase their entire suspension bridge in solid concrete.
That analogy perfectly captures the mechanism of what Bauer calls a civilizational loss of nerve.
A loss of nerve, that's a powerful phrase.
It is, and this is the critical mechanism we have to understand. The hardening of Islamic thought wasn't some sudden surge in authentic religious piety.
Right.
It was a symptom of a profound collapse in civilizational confidence. When the Islamic world collided with Western colonial modernity, when they faced the military, economic, and cultural dominance of the British and the French, the trauma was immense.
I mean, it must have been world-shattering.
Completely. Internal reformist movements looked at their own complex swaying traditions and they felt ashamed.
Because it didn't look like Europe.
Exactly. They felt it looked backward or disorganized compared to the hyper-categorized rigid structures of the Victorian colonizers. So like you said, they poured the concrete. Suddenly, ambiguity, that beautiful, necessary sway of the bridge, came to feel like a mortal threat to their very survival.
But pouring concrete over a suspension bridge doesn't actually make it stronger. It just replaces flexibility with certainty. And certainty, when it is that absolute and defensive, is incredibly rigid.
And what are the physics of a rigid structure when it encounters a sudden opposing force?
It just snaps.
It cannot sway. It cannot absorb the impact. It just shatters. Bauer calls this modern condition brittleness.
Brittleness?
Yes, we have moved from a culture of ambiguity to an ideology of brittleness. It is a mindset that has entirely lost the capacity to hold tension.
Which brings us right back to that street in Berlin.
It does.
If we apply this historical diagnosis to the 21-year-old attacker in that van, it completely changes how you have to view him. He isn't some ancient warrior of an unyielding faith.
Not at all.
He is the ultimate manifestation of this modern disease of brittleness.
Yeah.
His ideology is so incredibly fragile that it literally shatters upon contact with difference.
That's exactly what happened.
He looks out through the windshield at a crowd of people at Christopher Street Day. People who are different, who represent a plurality of human existence, who don't fit into his concrete boxes, and his ideology cannot tolerate the tension of their mere existence.
The anxiety of that ambiguity is just too much.
Right. It's so overwhelming that his only psychological recourse is to try and destroy the source of the tension.
And that is the profound tragedy at the center of this narrative. He believes, with every fiber of his being, that he is acting in the name of a 1,400-year-old tradition.
But he's not.
No, he is entirely cut off from it. He has inherited the frantic brittleness of the modern era, the trauma of that civilizational loss of nerve, not the capaciousness of the classical Islamic tradition.
He has no share in it.
None. He has absolutely no share in that older Islam that could hold contradiction as a mode of meaning. He is a modern man, dealing with a modern anxiety, using modern violence.
Okay, but if classical Islam wasn't this rigid system of concrete laws and punitive certainty, we have to establish what it actually was.
Yes, we need to fill in that blank.
Because you can't just say, oh, it was ambiguous and leave it there, right? What did that lived reality actually look like for the millions of people who inhabited it? The sources are really adamant that if we only look at the legal rulings, we are completely missing the reality of the civilization.
To understand the texture of that lived reality, we have to turn to Shahab Ahmed's monumental work, What is Islam?
Such an incredible book.
It really is. Ahmed's core thesis is a direct challenge to how we study religion today. He insists that we cannot reduce Islam merely to fiqh.
And fiqh is the legal system, right?
Yes, fiqh is the Islamic jurisprudence, the rigid yes and no of the legal scholars. If you only read the law books, you get a highly distorted view of the society.
Like judging modern America only by reading the tax code.
Exactly. To correct this, he introduces this concept of the Balkans to Bengal complex.
When I first read that phrase, the Balkans to Bengal complex, my mind immediately just went to a map. The geography of it is staggering.
It covers a massive area.
We are talking about a continuous swath of humanity stretching from Eastern Europe down through the Middle East, across Central Asia, and deep into the Indian subcontinent. But Ahmed isn't just drawing a map, is he?
No, not at all.
He's trying to describe an atmosphere.
Exactly. He is mapping a vast, interconnected cultural and psychological sphere that existed roughly from the 14th to the 19th centuries. And Ahmed shows that for the vast majority of Muslims across this massive region, Islam was not lived as a strict adherence to a list of rules.
What was it then?
It was lived as a vast, capacious, and completely self-contradicting exploration of meaning. The culture was intensely comfortable with holding seemingly opposed ideas in the exact same space.
And the sources give us such vivid, almost jarring examples of what this looked like on the ground. We aren't just talking about abstract theological debates in a university somewhere.
Right, it was part of daily life.
We are talking about societies that actively produced and celebrated wine poetry.
Which goes directly against the legal prohibition of alcohol.
Exactly. You had deep philosophical traditions that questioned the very nature of revelation. They commissioned stunning figural paintings and miniatures, even though some legalists strictly forbade the depiction of the human form.
Yeah, the art is a perfect example of that contradiction.
And you had the profound, ecstatic Sufi contemplation of beauty existing right alongside the rigid law, and very often, those two things were in open public tension with one another.
And the crucial point Ahmed makes is that to be Muslim in this context was to inhabit that very tension.
So it wasn't a flaw in the system.
No, it was a system. It wasn't about choosing the law over the poetry or the philosophy over the law. It was about living within the friction between them.
That is so hard for us to grasp today.
It is. And to understand the emotional depth of this, our sources bring in Anne-Marie Schimmel's classic text, Mystical Dimensions of Islam.
A beautiful book.
Yes. Schimmel maps out a world where the fundamental orientation of the faith wasn't about avoiding punishment. It was about the path toward union with the divine.
This section of the reading completely dismantled my preconceptions, because when we think of the greatest, most universally revered voices of Islamic civilization, the figures who are still quoted today, like Ibn Arabi, the brilliant philosopher mystic, right, or Rumi, whose poetry is still a bestseller all over the world today, or Hafiz, or Rabia of Basra.
The heavyweights of the tradition.
Yeah, these towering figures, the architects of the Islamic imagination, they did not speak the language of rigid, punitive law.
No, they didn't.
They spoke the language of love. Their entire vocabulary was built on longing, heartbreak, and the absolute annihilation of the self in the presence of God.
We have to pause and consider the mechanism of how this changes a society. In this mystical dimension, the human heart's yearning for beauty wasn't seen as a worldly distraction.
It wasn't a sin.
No, it wasn't a temptation pulling you away from religion. It was the very engine of religion itself. The mysticism provided the emotional vocabulary for the entire civilization.
I really want to press on this because it runs so completely counter to the puritanical narrative we are fed today. You're saying that the intense human desire, the yearning we feel when we encounter profound beauty, wasn't viewed as a sin that had to be repressed and locked away, but rather as the actual vehicle that drives a person closer to the divine.
Yes, exactly. And the mechanics of how they articulated this are fascinating. It is most beautifully illustrated in the Persianate poetic tradition through the concept of the shahid.
The word translates to the witness, right?
Correct, the shahid. In this poetic and spiritual tradition, gazing upon a beautiful human face could literally be an act of spiritual contemplation.
That is amazing.
Yeah. The physical beauty of a human being, the symmetry, the grace, was viewed as a physical trace, a reflection of the ultimate, unseeable divine beauty.
So by loving the physical, you are witnessing the divine.
Exactly. The tradition understood something incredibly profound about human psychology. They recognized that the intense, earthly, erotic longing to be completely undone by love, that feeling of losing your mind and your ego because you were so captivated by another person.
Right, that overwhelming feeling.
Yes, that feeling is the closest analogy we have as human beings to the soul's longing for God. They did not flinch from the erotics of the soul. They harnessed it.
But wait, how does a society organized around that kind of intense poetic vulnerability actually survive?
That's the logical modern question.
Because modern fundamentalists argue that you need rigid laws to make a civilization strong. The essay seems to argue the exact opposite. It suggests that a civilization organized around love, beauty, and the profound longing of the human heart is actually infinitely stronger and more resilient than the brittle ideology of the attacker in the van.
And the historical record completely backs that up. This suppleness, this emotional and cultural flexibility is actually the secret mechanism behind how Islam became a global religion.
Because it wasn't just conquest.
Exactly. There is this pervasive modern myth, often repeated in Western political discourse, that Islam spread primarily at the point of a sword, that it was an endless wave of violent, top-down military conquest.
Right, the whole convert or die narrative.
Yes, but when you look at the historical texts, the mechanics of its expansion were entirely different. The faith spread along trade routes. It spread through the lodges of the Sufi mystics.
The sources bring in Richard Eaton's study of the Bengal frontier as like the perfect case study for this mechanism. When Islam moved into Bengal, it wasn't a conquering army forcing peasants to convert under threat of death.
Not at all.
Eaton shows how it took root through slow agrarian settlement. You had these mystics, known as peers, and holy men who went out into the uncleared forests. They physically wove themselves into the local landscape.
They did the hard work.
Yeah, they helped clear the land, they established local shrines, they became mediators in local disputes, they integrated Islamic cosmology with the local agrarian cycle.
And we see this exact same mechanism replicated across the globe, from the sub-Saharan cultures of West Africa all the way to the island networks of the Indonesian archipelago. Islam moved with merchants and Sufis.
And because it was so flexible, right?
Yes. Because it was not a brittle, rigid monolith, it had the capacity to adapt. It could absorb local traditions. It translated its core metaphysical truths into 1,000 different local idioms.
Which a rigid system just can't do.
A brittle, rigid ideology cannot do that. If you are rigid, your only tool for expansion is conquest and enforcement. If the local culture doesn't fit your concrete box, you have to smash the culture.
Right.
But a supple, confident faith can cross the globe by invitation, adaptation, and integration.
Okay, so this brings us to what the author of the essay openly admits is the hardest part of the conversation. And honestly, it is the most crucial part for you listening right now because it forces us to confront our own deeply held modern assumptions about identity.
It's a challenging topic.
It is. If this classical Islamic world was so capacious, so comfortable with ambiguity, and so deeply invested in the poetry of human desire, well, how did it actually govern sexuality?
Right, because the modern contrast is so stark.
Exactly, because today, the clash between modern Islamism and LGBTQ identity is presented as absolute, like a war of annihilation.
This is the pivot point of the entire deep dive, and we have to tread very carefully here. We must rely strictly on historical facts, resisting both modern progressive attempts to retroactively find pride parades in the 16th century and conservative polemics that project modern homophobia backward in time.
We have to look at what was actually there.
Exactly. To do this, the essay relies heavily on Khaled El-Rouaib's essential study, Before Homosexuality in the Arab Islamic World, 1500 to 1800.
Okay.
And the central, undeniable, heavily documented premise of his research is this. The modern Western category of homosexuality, and along with it, the demand for a state-recognized sexual identity, did not exist in the classical Islamic world.
And the essay is incredibly precise about the mechanics of this absence. This wasn't a case where people were just heavily repressed, hiding in the shadows and afraid to speak its name.
No, it wasn't the closet.
Right. It wasn't a silence born of fear or the threat of the secret police. It was the literal absence of the conceptual category.
The concept simply wasn't there.
The idea of the homosexual as a unified, defining psychological identity simply had not been invented.
What El-Rouaib does so brilliantly is unpack the profound differences in how that culture categorized human behavior compared to how we do it today. He shows that pre-modern Arab Islamic culture made very sharp distinctions between behaviors and feelings that our modern world fuses together into a single, inescapable identity.
We really need to break down those distinctions because this is where the modern mind really struggles to comprehend the past. We want to put it in our boxes.
We do.
So what were the different categories they used to map this territory of desire?
El-Rouaib outlines a tripartite distinction.
Okay, 3 parts.
First, there was the passionate, often chaste love of a beautiful youth. This was not hidden. It was celebrated openly, often in exquisite poetry, by incredibly pious, respectable, and even married men. It was seen as a testament to the refinement of one's soul.
So having these feelings made you refined, not a sinner.
Yes. Second, there was the general aesthetic appreciation of male beauty, which we already touched on with the concept of the shaheed. The culture was obsessed with the aesthetics of the male form.
Right. And the third category?
The third category was the specific physical sexual act of liwa, which roughly translates as sodomy. And this is the crucial point. The jurists, the legal scholars, absolutely did condemn the physical act of liwa.
Okay, stop right there. I really need to push back on this, or at least play devil's advocate, because I want to make sure the logic holds up.
Go ahead.
If the legal scholars strictly condemned the physical act, how did these highly respected, pious, religious scholars get away with publicly writing ardent, passionate love poetry to beautiful boys?
It seems like a contradiction to us.
Totally. Wouldn't a judge read that poem and say, aha, a confession, throw him in jail? How did a society reconcile the poetry with the law?
You are looking at the past through the lens of modern, post-Freudian psychology.
Okay, explain that.
You are assuming that a poem about desire is proof of an underlying unified sexual identity that inevitably leads to a specific physical act. The classical jurists did not think that way.
They didn't connect the two?
No, they did not attach the sin to the feeling of love or to the aesthetic appreciation or to the person's soul. The sin, if the jurists were going to invoke it, was attached exclusively to the physical act itself.
The act, not the thought.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And unless 4 eyewitnesses literally saw the act occurring, which is the impossibly high evidentiary bar set by Islamic law, there was no crime.
Wow. So because the law was incredibly narrow and only focused on policing a very specific physical action, it accidentally, or perhaps intentionally, left this massive, unpoliced, imaginative space for the expression of same-sex desire.
Precisely. The law's prohibition of a particular physical act simply never colonized the broader imaginative space of the culture.
The bridge could still sway.
Yes. The poetry, the yearning, the aesthetic appreciation, all of that flourished openly without contradicting a person's religious identity or destroying their social standing. A man could be a revered scholar of Islamic law, a devoted father, and the author of passionate poems to a young man, and his society did not see those things as a contradiction. They did not demand he choose a side.
And the texts go even further when it comes to the concept of gender itself, showing that it wasn't just a rigid binary either.
Right, which is another modern assumption.
The sources cite Everett Rassen's work on the Mukanathun. I had honestly never heard this term before. Who were they, and how did they fit into the society?
The Mukanathun were gender-liminal figures in early Medina.
Meaning they crossed gender boundaries?
Yes, these were biological men who lived, dressed, and were socially received as something distinct from the standard masculine norm. They often occupied specific social roles, sometimes as matchmakers, musicians, or entertainers.
Okay.
And what is most historically significant about Rawson's work is that it proves these figures were present at the very origin of the Islamic community. They lived in Medina during the life of the Prophet Muhammad.
So they weren't a later decadent addition, like some corruption of the original faith. They were there at the genesis of the faith.
Yes, they were. While their social status was sometimes debated or marginalized by later scholars, the undeniable fact of their visible presence in early Islamic history proves that the conceptualization of gender in early Islam was vastly more capacious, flexible, and complicated than modern polemicists on any side of the political spectrum are willing to admit.
So let's look at the board for a second. We have this massive, historically documented, imaginative space for same-sex desire. We have a culture that completely separates acts from identity. We have gender-liminal figures present at the birth of the community. We have revered scholars writing love poems to men.
All historical facts.
Which begs the million-dollar question. If that was the lived reality for centuries, how on earth did we end up with the rigid, violent, exclusionary puritanism of the Berlin attacker? Where did this extreme brittleness regarding sexuality actually come from?
To answer that, the essay pivots to the historical research of Afsana Najmabadi, who studies Iranian modernity, and Drozievi, who studies the Ottoman Middle East.
Two incredible scholars.
They both track the mechanisms of a massive historical disruption. They document how that older, fluid, capacious economy of desire was systematically and deliberately heteronormalized.
Heteronormalized.
Yes, it's forcibly flattened into the rigid modern binary of hetero versus homo, and this flattening happened under the immense crushing pressure of Western modernity during the 19th and 20th centuries.
How exactly did that happen? I mean, was it forced on them by colonial armies, or did they do it to themselves?
It was a complex mixture of both, driven by the internalization of the colonizer's gaze.
The colonizer's gaze?
Yeah. As European powers began to dominate the Middle East militarily and economically, European travelers, missionaries, and colonial administrators encountered this fluid sexuality and the ubiquitous homoerotic poetry. And the Victorians were horrified.
Well, yeah, they were Victorians.
Exactly. They labeled the Islamic world as decadent, perverse, and effeminate. They used this supposed moral decay as a primary justification for their colonial rule. They essentially said, you are weak and conquerable because you are sexually deviant.
And the tragic part is the reformists within the Islamic world actually believed them.
Exactly. When Ottoman and Qajar elites looked for ways to modernize and resist European domination, they didn't just import European telegraphs and military tactics.
They imported the culture.
They imported European Victorian morality. They rewrote their penal codes based on French and British models. They literally purged their own classical poetry, translating and editing it to erase the male pronouns.
Erasing their own history.
Yes, frantically trying to hide their own history of same-sex desire just to appear civilized in the eyes of London and Paris. They poured the concrete over their own suspension bridge.
This is the ultimate tragic irony of this entire deep dive. It is the realization that completely flips the script on modern extremism.
It really does.
Think about the Islamists today, men like the attacker in the van. They genuinely believe that by violently enforcing a rigid sexual order, by policing gender, by attacking queer communities, they're defending pure, unadulterated, classical Islam against the decadent corruption of the West.
Right.
But the history proves that the rigid sexual order they are defending is actually a 19th century import from the West.
It is a profound, almost unbearable irony. The men driving these vans, believing they are striking a righteous blow against the corrupting influence of the modern West, are, without knowing it, the most thoroughly westernized men in the room.
That is just wild to wrap your head around.
They aren't defending classical Islam. They are defending the ghost of Victorian Puritanism. They have internalized the moral panic and the rigid binaries of their former colonizers, and they have tragically mistaken those colonial imports for ancient divine law.
That is just a staggering realization. They took the concrete that the colonial engineers poured over the suspension bridge, forgot there was ever a bridge underneath it, and convinced themselves the concrete is sacred.
That is exactly the mechanism of their radicalization.
Now, we need to pause here and make something very explicit.
Yes.
The argument here is incredibly provocative, and whether you agree with it or not, it forces us to look at how Western liberalism operates on a global scale. Now, we are strictly exploring the historical and sociological arguments laid out in our source texts.
We aren't taking sides here.
Right. We aren't endorsing a political stance. But it is vital to explore this next section impartially, because while the sources offer a devastating critique of modern Islamists, they also offer a profound and potentially very uncomfortable critique of the modern Western approach to sexual identity.
This brings us to the work of Joseph Massad, specifically his highly debated book, Desiring Arabs.
A very controversial text.
It is. Massad offers a fierce critique of what he provocatively calls the gay international, which is his term for the global, heavily Western-funded campaign to universalize the modern Western framework of gay identity and export it to the rest of the world.
Right, because if we just spent the last half hour establishing that the classical Islamic world had a completely different, highly nuanced way of organizing desire and identity, then taking a modern Western template and forcing it onto other societies might not be the universal act of liberation it is often framed as.
Exactly. Massad argues that imposing this Western template onto societies that historically never organized their intimate lives around confessional identities causes real, tangible damage.
Let's look at the mechanics of why that is.
We have to examine the mechanics of Western liberalism to understand why. The Western demand, the demand that you must name yourself, that you must publicly declare your sexual identity before the state and society to be considered authentic, grows out of a very specific European cultural soil.
Right, the Enlightenment.
Yes, it centers entirely on the concept of the sovereign individual. It is the post-Enlightenment conviction that the self is only truly free when it is publicly categorized, legally recognized by the state, and protected by rights.
It's the core philosophy behind the concept of coming out, isn't it? The idea that if you don't publicly declare your identity, you are inherently living a lie or suffering under oppression, and that public visibility is the only path to true freedom.
Exactly. But Massad points out that this is simply not the axis around which Islamic civilization turned.
They had a totally different center.
The classical Islamic anthropology, its understanding of what a human being is, was completely different. It did not center the sovereign individual. It centered the ummah, the collective community. In that historical framework, a person's inner life, their private desires, and their intimate actions were strictly a matter between themselves and God.
The realm of the private was fiercely protected?
It was almost sacred. It was neither the business of the state nor the business of the mosque to interrogate your inner life. God was the only judge of the unseen.
So forcing visibility actually changes the system.
By introducing the Western demand for public confession and state recognition, Massad argues that the gay international actually incites a violent backlash.
How so?
By forcing people to publicly identify with a category that local authorities associate with Western cultural imperialism, it forces the state to police behaviors that, historically, it would have simply ignored under the veil of discretion.
So it was a culture of profound discretion. But the expert analysis in our sources points out that this discretion is a double-edged sword, right? It's not exactly a perfect utopia.
No, it absolutely cut both ways, and we cannot romanticize the past. Classical Islam was not some progressive liberal utopia that celebrated sexual minorities in the way a modern pride parade does.
Right. They weren't marching in the streets.
No, it did not celebrate them as a distinct, empowered identity group. But crucially, because it never demanded the confessional declaration of sexual identity, it also never demanded the modern inquisition into it. It did not celebrate, but it also did not hunt.
Consider what this means for our understanding of the Berlin attacker. It means that his obsession, and the obsession of certain strains of contemporary political Islamism, with policing, exposing, and violently excluding sexual minorities, none of that is the recovery of an authentic Islamic past.
Not at all.
The classical scholars wouldn't even recognize his behavior. It is a completely modern pathology dressed up in old clothes. It's that brittle certainty Bauer described, forged in the trauma of the 19th century, turned into a deadly weapon in the 21st.
The violence is the tragic end result of losing civilizational confidence. When a culture loses the confidence to let the inner life remain between the individual and the divine, it panics.
They had to control everything.
Exactly. It demands conformity, demands to see everything, categorize everything, and violently police everything that doesn't fit the newly imported concrete mold.
So hearing all of this history, the immense capaciousness of the early centuries, the poetry, the tragic flattening by colonialism, the modern crisis of identity, it naturally leads to the question of where things stand right now for believers.
Right.
Is this beautiful, flexible suspension bridge of a tradition purely historical? Is it trapped in a museum, or is it alive enough to adapt to the realities of believers living today?
The sources emphasize that this is not a dead historical artifact. There is a live, rigorous, and often very tense theological debate happening within the tradition right now.
And it's happening on the tradition's own terms,
Mhm.
right?
Exactly. For example, the essay introduces the work of Scott Kugel. In his book, Homosexuality in Islam, Kugel attempts a radical theological recovery. He offers a complete rereading of the story of Lot.
The story of Lot, which is shared across the Abrahamic faiths in the Bible and the Quran, is usually the definitive, unassailable text used by clerics to condemn same-sex relations. How does Kugel manage to reread it? What is his mechanism for reinterpretation?
Kugel dives deep into the linguistic and historical context of the verses. He argues that the story of Lot is not actually a condemnation of love or consensual same-sex desire or the quest for intimacy.
Then what is it about?
He argues that the sin of the people of Lot was fundamentally about coercion, sexual violence, and a profound violation of the sacred laws of hospitality.
Mhm.
They were attempting to assert power through assault.
Okay.
Based on this reading and a broader theological framework that emphasizes God's expansive justice, Kugel makes the case that the Quran, when read without the accumulated prejudices of later centuries, can fully embrace gay, lesbian, and transgender Muslims.
Now, the sources also balance this by bringing in Keishali's book, Sexual Ethics in Islam, because it's important to note that Kugel's view is not the universally accepted standard. It is highly controversial.
Yes, Kugel's reading is intensely disputed by many mainstream jurists who argue he is stretching the text to fit modern sensibilities. Keisha Ali provides a much more measured, academically cautious survey of the landscape.
She takes a different approach.
She does. She shows how much of what passes for a timeless, unchanging ruling in Islamic law is actually historically contingent.
Meaning it was shaped by the politics of the time.
Exactly, meaning it was shaped by the specific political and social anxieties of the time and place it was written. But she also acknowledges how much the classical sources actually settle, and she points out the real methodological challenges in trying to stretch classical jurisprudence to accommodate modern human rights frameworks.
But the point the author of our primary essay makes by citing both Kugel and Ali isn't to declare one side the theological winner, right? We aren't here to solve Islamic theology.
No, that's not our goal.
The point is to prove to you that a serious, rigorous, real debate exists right now, conducted by serious believers who love their tradition.
And if we connect this back to the overarching theme of ambiguity and brittleness, a confident faith, a civilization that remembers its own capaciousness can hold this debate.
It can tolerate the friction.
It can tolerate the tension of Kugel and his conservative critics arguing over the texts. It can absorb that friction without collapsing and without resorting to violence.
Right.
It is only a brittle faith, one terrified of ambiguity and difference, that feels it has lost the argument so thoroughly that it needs a rented van to settle a theological dispute.
And the essay brings us all home by tying it back to the core text of Islam itself. It points to a specific verse in the Quran, Surah 30, verse 22. It is a verse that explicitly states that the creation of the heavens and the earth and the diversity of human tongues and colors are a sign of God.
Think about the absolute devastating contrast there. The attacker in Berlin looked out through the windshield at the vibrant diversity of the Christopher Street Day crowd, and his brittle ideology saw a mortal threat that had to be violently eliminated.
He saw something to destroy.
But the very text he claims to defend, the text he likely memorized, looks out at the irreducible variety of the human condition, the different ways we love, speak, and exist, and calls it divine.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to take you back to where we started. Back to that street in Berlin, back to that tragic day in July 2026. The ultimate tragedy of that young man in the van is that the very capaciousness he could not tolerate, the immense, messy, beautiful, swaying diversity of that crowd, is not actually a modern Western gift to Islam.
It's really not.
As our sources have painstakingly shown, from the poetry of the Shaheed to the gender-liminal figures of Medina, that capaciousness is Islam's older gift to itself.
The true task ahead, as the essay argues so powerfully, isn't about constantly sharpening a dichotomy between Islam and the modern world as if they are locked in an eternal war of civilizations.
We hear that narrative so much.
We do, but it's false. The task is the arduous work of recovering a civilizational confidence. A confidence that, for centuries, successfully held the longing, the love, the ambiguity, and the irreducible variety of human beings without shattering.
We love things to be clean, binary, and visible. Broken or not broken, gay or straight, east or west. But human history, the complexities of human desire, and the depths of human faith defy that kind of clinical machinery. The suspension bridge of classical Islam was built to sway with the complexities of the human heart, not to be encased in the concrete of 19th century Victorian morality.
And that leads to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over long after this deep dive ends. We've just explored how a 19th century Western idea about sexual order was so successfully disguised that people today will literally kill to defend it, genuinely believing it to be an ancient sacred truth.
It's chilling.
It is. It forces us to turn that lens on ourselves. What deeply held traditional beliefs in your own life, your own religion, or your own culture are actually just recent imports. How much of what we confidently call timeless is just a rigidness we invented yesterday to soothe our own modern anxieties.